new series of conversations among the archival studies faculty of the UP School of Library and Information Studies. Every episode, we talk about issues and experiences with records in our everyday life. I am Iyra Buenrostro-Cabbab, and with me are my awesome fellow faculty members in UP SLIS. We have Jonathan Isit. Hi, Nathan.
Hello.
Yes, and we also have Bono Gado. Hi, Bono.
Hi there. Hi, everyone.
And who is on a different time zone? What time is it there?
It's 10:53 p.m. on a Friday night.
On a Friday night.
That
Thanks for
is
joining.
dedication.
Yeah, I hope you're not yet sleepy.
No, okay pa naman.
Okay, so you do it for the love of archives. Thank
Sure.
you, Bob. All right, so this is our second episode. Yay! Thank you so much for watching our pilot episode, and for those who listened to our podcast, thanks so much. So in our first episode, we talked about, or we discussed some important principles in archives and records management, and that includes power, authority, and transparency, and of course, the usefulness and even unusefulness of records in our everyday life. So we use, what are those records again? The quarantine pass and the SAC forms as our examples. And we deconstructed those records using their qualities, such as the content, the context, and the text. So thank you so much once again for joining us in our pilot episode. And also thank you for your comments and feedback. Okay, so we're reading all those comments and we're taking note of those. And please keep them coming. Can I talk about the feedback that we received?
Yeah,
Is it
what are some of the feedbacks? Because
Okay.
I did not go through them.
Oh yeah, I saw some feedback on Facebook, and some people were sending me messages on Facebook as well. So I think one of the feedback that we received is that can we use more Filipino words and sentences in our discussion, in our conversations, or even Taglish, combination of Tagalog and English? Can we do that?
Pwede naman. Sure.
Definitely, no? Pwede po. At marami
Hola.
pong salamat. Yes, marami pong salamat sa suggestion. We will definitely do that. Of course, first episodes are the testing ground, ano? Para kung nanonood lang ng series or Korean drama, during the first episode, okay, this is so dragging, and then we'll get a chance, this is the second episode. So speaking of second episode, we also received some suggestions on the succeeding topics for our next episode. So meron tayong database literacy for barangay. We also received some suggestions that pwedeng i-discuss yung kahalagahan ng records or pagkakaroon ng centralized database for records in the local government levels or even in the national government. And what can we do as records professionals to promote good records management practices and archiving at the government level? So if we look at the suggestions, we could really see that records are really important for identification and all. So the reason why we want to have a centralized database o gusto nating magkaroon ng proper records management and archiving practices, dahil gusto natin na mapadali yung pagproseso ng mga activities ng government, and at the same time for the government to easily identify people and for the government to efficiently give services and distribute goods to the people. So speaking of identification, so this is our second episode. So we relate records with identity. So records as forms of identification and their affordances and limits. So i-discuss natin for this episode yung paggamit natin ng records and for identification, and at the same time yung mga limitasyon ng mga records na ginagamit natin o yung mga records na nire-require sa atin. Okay? So, Bono.
Yes.
Yeah. So I remember you had this record from, or this letter from Donald Trump, right?
Yeah. Well, it was so parang I was looking at it again after we shot our first episode. Tapos napansin ko it has all my information, right? It's like my name, my address, all of the other stuff. But then the letter started with like my fellow Americans. And I'm like not an American. Um but
At
apparently
least may pera ka, okay lang yan.
yeah, totally. I'll take I'll take money. Yeah, but it's interesting because it's a reminder of how, especially for us, like I know Nathan lived in the UK for a while, and then Ira, you lived in Singapore. I live back and forth here in the US. Used to live in New York, now I'm in California. Na parang we're constantly reminded that we're foreign bodies in a like foreign land and how our forms of identification, whether it's our like passport, student visa, letters such as this, it's a constant reminder and an object that we use to identify ourselves and for others to identify us properly as well. Yeah, it's been very tricky. It's like if there's one of pet peeve ko when it comes to figuring out records is any record that has to do with borders, identification and borders, like passport, visa. Um, it's frustrating because I have to carry them around and I have to apply to get these things just to assert who I am. And it's yeah, and it's I guess it's one of those things that we're going to talk about in this particular episode. Kayo ba, when you guys were living in Singapore or in the UK, were there any particular forms of identification that parang struck you?
Um, yeah, when I was living in the UK, a big part of my identity was my biometric residence permit. It's the equivalent of the visa for staying in the UK. And every single transaction that you do, opening an account, getting any other identification, you need to present that BRP. As well, I remember when I applied for my provisional driving license and I had to send my passport away by mail. So it was for 2 weeks. I didn't have my passport with me and it felt like a big part of me was missing. The thing is, when you go outside of the country, the only valid identification that you have will be identification, your passport, or identification that the host country issued you, which would be the BLP or any other licenses that you have. Which meant when I didn't have my passport, I didn't really have any other form of identification. So who am who am I? What can I do? I can't access any services without being able to show that ID. Even the concept of, oh, it's fine, you have a school ID, you have a work ID, but outside of the places that have issued that identification, it doesn't really have meaning. It doesn't hold any power. And I think even here in the Philippines, we know that when we're transacting with government offices and we're asked for a valid ID, how many times have we tried presenting our UP ID? Uh, Technically, UP is a government office, but it's not considered a government issued ID, and thus it doesn't have that same level of power and identity that an official ID gives you.
Yeah, speaking of government IDs here in the Philippines, it's so funny that you don't have an ID, so you're applying for another government issued ID, but they will require you to present two valid IDs. So, what if I don't have one, right? So it's that's the thing about here in the Philippines when applying for those kind of identification. So going back to your question, Bono, yeah, of course. In Singapore, you can stay there as a tourist for 30 days. But of course, when you go beyond those number of days, kailangan mo na ng pass. You must have a student pass or a work pass or working pass. So it depends on your category, dun sa kanila. So you have to apply for it. And of course, there are requirements before you can qualify to get those IDs. But actually, yeah, I didn't really have to carry it around with me all the time. Maybe because I, I don't know. Probably because I am blending in with the people, and I don't know anyone. who get who got questioned because they did not bring their IDs with them, except for some circumstances that you really have to present your identification. We call it the IC.
Well, it's not so much that you always have to carry it around, but it's the knowledge that when you need it, you have
Oh yeah.
something to show, you have something to say, this is who I am.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's the interesting part, right? But if like as an exercise for anyone, if you go pick up your wallet and you look at all the IDs that you have there,
Yeah, that's true.
it's a lot can be said, right? Like a story about a particular person or who that person is can be drawn from like the collection of IDs that one would have inside one's wallet. So I don't have my wallet with
I
me
have
right
my wallet with me.
now.
What's your
Okay.
EDC
What's it,
for
what's,
ID?
what are your identification cards and what does it say about you? What's inside your wallet?
Really? Seryoso to? Kasi okay, so here I have my cards, my postal ID, my student ID in Singapore, NTU, which we can also use as a cash card, and an MRT and BAS card. Diba, ang saya. My UP ID and UMID. Daming ID. My IKEA card. Of course, we don't have IKEA here, but still here. My Starbucks card.
So looking at your set of IDs, one can parang draw na you're a faculty member at UP, former student at NTU from Singapore, an avid lover of coffee and furniture. And it speaks a lot, right? Like parang those ID cards, those records that we carry with us provides us access to certain services, certain spaces, and at the same time asserts like our identities in terms of who we are, what we do, what we like. So it's like there's a lot that a particular ID card can actually say. Besides from just like what's my name. Yeah.
Yeah, and even the photos inside your wallet. Photos, right? Yeah.
What's your favorite? My favorite photo in my ID was my my second year ID in Ateneo. That was like the best.
Oh.
Everything else I kind of look.
Yeah,
So,
I know.
I just remembered when you were talking about photos and IDs, one of my late mentor long ago told me to always have my ID taken in UP. I'm not sure whether I should mention it, but I actually have 4 different UP IDs, UP student IDs. Because what she told me was have your photo taken regularly and it will show how you're growing up in the university. It's not just the identification, but rather how you change it. Even when talking about the UP ID, since I've moved from the College of Engineering to SLIS, the text in the ID also changes. Oh, you're no longer studying to be an engineer. You're now studying to be an architect.
Aside from the physical evolution, right?
Yeah.
So we can see there is like the initial primary value of the ID, which is to be used as an identification during a very particular time, right? Like in that case, yung time mo bilang isang estudyante sa UP, eventually, wala siyang validity at a certain point because you're no longer a student. But then it starts having like a secondary value, as you mentioned, like your own personal history, tracing like your changes like physically or your historical parang background or progression in UP as you change programs. So yeah, there's I find IDs fascinating as a form of record.
And that's when IDs become frustrating, when the identity they're supposed to be evidencing is not the identity that you currently possess. So for example, sometimes when you have a driving license, what they do is, even though they ask in the renewal form what your current weight is, what your current height is, they never bother updating it in the database, so that when they print the new driving license and give it to you, it's still your old weight and old height, which is frustrating when you're trying to lose weight and you've achieved a good weight loss. But also, why do you need weight and height on a driving license, on an identification in the first place? I can understand listing blood type, emergency contacts in case of emergencies, but what's the point of height and weight?
I don't have a driving license, so I don't know why. So I was thinking, will it have any effect on your ability to drive if you're underweight or overweight? But then again, that's correct, right? Why when something has, for example, an information about the person holding the identification card has already changed, and then if you're updating or reapplying for another identification card, why don't you update also that information, like the weight, the height?
It's just like supposedly those information, the height and weight, is so that the person who's looking at your ID can look at your ID, look at you, and say, yeah, this is you, right?
Mhm.
But then, so what happens if the person who owns the ID gained weight, like is 200 pounds, but the ID says that he's 100 pounds? As the one actually assessing the situation, will you be like, yeah, this is not you, or this ID is not valid? So, but at the same time, it's like, how can you actually do it? Because people's weight just change. They can, I mean, like right now in the pandemic, I'm pretty sure we're gaining weight every single week. So we're all gonna look very different from our IDs pre-pandemic. So
And talking about things that change in the IDs, I believe, Iyra, you've had some frustrations with your name in your ID cards.
Yeah, tell me about it. Yeah, I know that my name is hard to spell because my name is unique, my first and my last name, much more when I changed my name to my married name, my single name to a married name. So I opted to have my name hyphenated in my government records. For example, in the university or in GSIS and like EBIG, PhilHealth. And it took how many years before they accepted my request to change my name? I got married in 2013, and then when I checked my records in this government office, they haven't updated my name yet. So this actually led to two sets of records for me, one for my married name and one for my maiden name. So ang weird talaga. And it's also difficult to explain to these people that in accordance to our law, I could really use I could really use or retain my maiden name or even hyphenate my husband's name, my husband's last name. So, ang hirap i-explain din sa kanila. Probably it's also cultural because most of the time, they would expect married women to totally adopt their husband's name, their husband's last name. So it's kind of rare for them to see men applying or changing their names to a hyphenated one or even retaining their maiden name for that matter. So, sa totoo lang, magkakaiba yung ID ko. I have I have some IDs with me na maiden name pa rin. And then I also have my IDs na hyphenated. Pero wala akong ID with my husband's last name on it. Yun ang talagang pangalan ko. So I'm maintaining two sets of IDs now, just to, and it really defeats the purpose of standardizing your personal records for consistency. Kasi dahil nga dun sa mga ganung klaseng issue.
And at the same time, it also says a lot about the formation of your identity and who defines that identity. I just want to throw in the concept of the records continuum and how these records, while they are individual evidences, have a larger implication towards collective identity And for example, when we are talking about the married name in your identification, this identity is not just your identity, but rather an identity imposed on you by society. So talking about why do I have to define myself by my married name? Why do I have to define myself by my given name at birth and things like those?
Yeah, and it speaks a lot about the limitations of the records of specifically IDs in terms of reflecting our identities. Because as Nathan just mentioned, um, by the very nature of the form, the structure of these identification cards, it's still a mechanism of categorization, right? So, for example, if you look at a particular ID, specifically in the Philippines, your option for gender sex will just be pure binary of like male or female, which might not be an issue for cisgendered people, but for our trans colleagues, for our trans friends and lovers, it's very difficult because then they look at a particular ID and they have to be reminded that they are not being acknowledged by the state or by the office or by the institution that issues those IDs, precisely because the binariness of categorized genders are being imposed on them. So dito sa California, for example, it was only in recent years that your driver's license, now you have an option to actually choose like X as opposed to male and female. So what we're saying here is that as we look at our IDs and as we develop IDs in the future, we need to know that these records are supposedly dynamic and should reflect um, how culture is conceiving and reconceiving itself in terms of our diverse identities. It's a challenge though, kasi diba, parang iba-balance pa rin nila yung functionality of an ID with um, the expression of one's identity, which sometimes would really clash with each other.
Although I wonder if that is still an ongoing challenge when it comes to the physical identification itself, especially in today's consciousness of data protection and data privacy. When you're talking about what should be in the ID in the first place, is given that the ID is created to evidence a particular function. So as a student, as a driver, and so on, all you need to do is to show that the individual possessing that identification has the right to do whatever or has the right to engage in whatever activity the ID is supposed to permit, which means things like gender, things like age, birthday, height, weight, mass, or whatever you want to call it, shouldn't be in the ID anymore. It should be in the databases that those IDs are providing access to. But at the same time, we should have greater consciousness of how we are structuring those databases and how we are enabling people to define their identities. I remember when I went to get my ID for UCL, and one of the questions was, what do you want to be known as? This is a common problem, especially for names which are not usually found in English and have lots of syllables. But for me, it was really important because while my given name is Jonathan, I prefer to identify as Nathan. And part of obtaining that identification, my school ID is saying my my given name is Jonathan, but I want to be known as Nathan.
Yeah.
And that is embedded into the creation process of the ID.
Right. So to that point, it's not that difficult to do. It's not that difficult for institutions such as our schools, even our government, our place of work. It's not that difficult to accommodate those things. It's just that wala, nakasanayan na nila eh. Parang may image sila na parang ito dapat yung itsura ng isang ID. But if having these conversations and having our administrators, our records managers, whoever designs the IDs understand that our IDs are not only mechanisms of control and access. This means a lot in terms of identity formation as well, or identity assertion of individuals. And then we have to be sensitive about these things. Parang ano ba naman yung magbigay ka ng ilang extra options, diba? It's not that difficult.
Well, I remember when I was in Singapore, whenever we filled out forms, it could be an application form for research grant or basta, no? Whenever we fill out forms, they would usually ask about our race. Like, are you Chinese, Indian, Malay? There are only 3 categories there: Chinese, Indian, Malay, and others. So as a Southeast Asian Filipino, sabi ko, saan kaya ako dito? So I would always use others. So I think in their database, in the fields of information that they're expecting to be filled out, these are just the 3 categories. Ano? So meron pang iba, kay Sir Igor, I remember, when he's filling out this form in his university in South Africa, his categorization is on Pacific Islander. Yeah, so I mean, going back to Bono's point about setting categories for people's identification, for their own identification, sometimes it's really messy. It's really messy in a sense that we're putting a lot of limits to people without even asking them or without even knowing how they want to be identified. So, kunyari, gender.
And that's the problem. When the moment you put things in boxes, there will be things that won't fit in those boxes. And those things that don't fit in those boxes are automatically excluded. You're engaging in othering. And the records, by their very nature, propagate this act of othering, propagate this injustice.
Yes, that's true. But we can't help it. We need to set this category so that we can put order, right? Even as librarians, as archivists, as records managers, we always set these categories para may order. So that's our traditional conception of how records management or how archiving works. So there.
The key there lang is, yes, because we understand like the functions of categorizations and classification, but what we need to be reminded are that these categories and classifications are not fixed. That they're ever evolving, that they can constantly be questioned, and they should be questioned, and they should grow and develop as we move forward as well. So like it's really just that, right? Like balancing the functionality of these categories while at the same time constantly critiquing it to make it better for everyone.
And that should be done by archivists and records managers, that they should be more open to that there might be categories that we should always think about, okay, what would happen in the future? These categories could evolve. That we should be more, I remember one thing about imaginaries, Jonathan, like we have to be more imaginative and be more open to changes and, these things, these issues.
Yeah, and as well, it highlights the involvement of the records manager, the archivist, all throughout the records creation process, not just after the records have been created. Archivists should be actively involved in defining the structure of records even before they have been published or created.
Yeah, that's one key thing I always remind records managers when we do consulting work for corporations or other institutions. Like always have a records manager and archivist anytime you create forms or documents at the point of the design of the document or at the point of the design of the record, or in the case of what we're talking about now, in the design of the ID. And what categories are because like ideally your records manager should be able to know and identify, is this field really important, as yung pinoint out nga ni Jonathan kanina? Do we really need this in the first place? Or in addition, ano ba talaga kailangan makita dun sa ID? So bakit kailangan ba talaga ng picture? Or kailangan ba talaga yung buong address? Pati yung baka kailangan din ng
Homework, actually. Meron din iba homework.
Or or star sign, ganun. Parang I want to know, I want in all of my IDs to know that I'm a Libra. So,
Yeah. So this is the practical implication or parang practical example to ng records life cycle and records continuum. So these are the two main theoretical concepts in archives and records management. That in records continuum, the archivist and the records managers are working closely together upon the creation of a record or a document. So unlike in the records life cycle, it's highly time bound. So aside from these limitations that we're discussing, the limitations of identification cards, there's also an issue about expiration, right?
I don't know. I mean, why do you think ID cards expire?
I think fundamentally it brings us back to the concept of records for control. The reason you want identification cards to expire will be that once it expired, the person who has that ID will be forced to either undergo the process of obtaining a new identification along with the corresponding bureaucracy and financial motivations of doing so. And at the same time, it allows you to take away that right from others that you feel don't deserve them anymore or shouldn't have them anymore.
So also it has something to do with the services that you can obtain or avail of. For example, you only paid for this number of services, this number of years. So doon ka lang entitled. So other than that, no, you have to apply for another identification or you have to renew, for example, your membership. But how about in the case of driver's license, for example? Jonathan, you have one. So is it difficult? Is it difficult to obtain or to renew your driver's license
Well,
once it has expired?
no, provided you don't have any traffic violations logged with the LTO and MMDA, it's a simple process of queuing, having your photograph taken, and updating your details. Especially now that the period for expiry of our driver's license have been extended, I think it used to be 3 years and now it's 5 years. I think with the concept of renewal, it's more of a differentiation between what is a privilege and what is a right. Driving and the ability to drive will be a privilege. But things like voting, the what do you call the ID for voters ID?
Voter's ID. I have it. I have it here.
So the voters ID does not expire.
Yeah, it doesn't expire.
But then it gets you thinking, if it doesn't expire because it's a right, what's the purpose of having a picture in that voter's ID?
Oh, that's a good question because I read a blueprint in that voter's ID. So whenever I use that ID or whenever I would go to the precinct to vote every election, they would look at me with judgment, right? Like you look so much better you look so much better now than before. So would I take it as a compliment or so? Yeah. So I don't know why. Probably because again for identification, just to make sure that you are the person holding that ID. So you're the one who really wants it.
Yeah, sure. But I was about to say I actually like what Nathan just mentioned as well because so I understand, for example, like a student ID, right? So your student ID should generally be valid for like a year or just a quarter. And you should get another ID the following year because they don't know if you've matriculated, right? Or for like your ID for the gym, it's tied up to like your membership fees. So like if you paid your membership fee for a year, then it should be valid for a year. So there's a rationale why these particular identification expires. But as Jonathan mentioned, we can then start questioning why certain IDs, like the voter's ID, why should it expire? Like everyone at a particular age, when you turn 18, you should have the right to vote. Um, and that right can never be taken away from you or should never be taken away from you. And because of that, like why even bother for giving voters ID? We're in like each precinct is supposed to have their own parang list ng mga pwedeng bumoto, right? And then we can have different IDs anyways. So I would generally agree with Nathan, wherein that there's the government sometimes just wants to earn money, and imagine X number of money, X number of IDs times X number of cost would be like millions of pesos that will go to the government for a record that is actually not needed.
And
Oh,
that makes me think of the passport, for example. Why does a passport expire after, well, now it's 10 years, but
yes.
why not just renew the passport when you've run out of pages to use in it?
Maybe we can go from the Department of Foreign Affairs. Like the reasons why.
So if
Yeah, because that's all.
anyone,
Yeah.
Yeah, but I
Yeah, so
agree. Like, the mere fact that they extended it from what 5 to 10 years,
I think
the
that,
extension was arbitrary. It's like why? So
yeah.
what suddenly was like why? So
if anyone from the DFA is listening, ring us up and we'd love to have you as a guest in our program.
We'd love to hear from you. Please enlighten us. Thanks.
and don't get me started on identifications like for cars. I think there was like several years wherein everyone paid for like bagong plaka, but they
Oh,
never
yeah.
arrived. They
Yeah,
never arrived, but we all paid for it. It's like, where is that money? It's another set of like paying for a record or a document that has zero function. Or in this case, never siya nag-materialize. Just, ito na naman, nagalit na naman ako sa gobyerno.
Well, full disclosure, I paid for it and I got mine in time, so I couldn't really complain.
And there's another issue about IDs and government records again. There has been discussion about the national ID system. I think one of the reasons why we have this multiple IDs and a lot of inefficiencies with consolidating our information is that we don't have a national ID. So I think and the records management point of view, having a national ID would be really good. But then again, there's always a question on trust, public trust, and authority.
Very tricky. I'm sure we can have like one episode just talking about this
Yeah.
particular proposal. It's very tricky.
And talking about the national ID system, one of the things I'm also wondering about is, should IDs be physical in the first place? A key component of a national ID system will be the ability to integrate different services and connect to that identification. So if you are connecting those services anyway, why not just go with some sort of biometric identification rather than having a physical card that you have to show people?
Oh.
So yeah, same issues of privacy, trust, authority.
Yeah, privacy trust. Yeah, it's always like that. Public trust is always connected with record keeping, records management, and records creation. So if there's no public trust, what can I do?
And an additional layer, an additional concern there is not everyone will have access to getting such an ID. So
Yes.
there will be people that will be counted and people who won't be counted. That means certain individuals will have access to certain services and certain individuals won't have access to certain services. So unless the government, unless the citizens trust their government, and unless the government can ensure that everyone will be counted and the system is inclusive, I think it's very tricky to actually, or rather problematic to have a national ID system. I'm personally very iffy about it, but
I'm personally in support of it because I like the idea of integration, and it reminds me of one of the comments that we had in the first episode asking about the surveying from different agencies in the household. So they've got 5 different visits from 5 different people asking the same sort of information. And as much as possible in records management, we want to reduce these information silos. But part of reducing these information silos is increasing trust and as well increasing confidence in the authorities that maintain these records.
na basically nangyayari kasi dyan, basically what's happening here is that we have a record that authorities do not trust. So they're gonna put another set of record
Yeah.
to address that insecurity, and then another set of record to address that insecurity. So in the case of a voter's ID, you have like a roster of list of people in the precinct to vote, but even that they're not quite trusting of that particular thing. So then they'll require you, yeah, they'll require you another set of ID and another set of ID. Which the bottom line here is that even the government, they don't trust the record system that they have in place, the identification they have set in place. And they're trying to solve it by just slapping another one, which they also don't trust. So.
Yeah, because of the insecurity, and then the bad thing about it is that they're putting more burden to people. Like, okay, you have to apply for another ID for you to secure these services, for you to avail of these services, or even to do your right to vote, for example, or even your right and privilege or privilege to travel, right, for instance, or even to drive your own car. So yun yung nagiging problema, I guess, because of this, I don't want to say inefficiencies, but and insecurities. Ayoko maging negative masyado, pero ganun yun. Okay, so talking about the limitations and expiration of identification cards, I remember something that I have to renew my PRC ID soon. It's going to expire.
Okay, so I'm pretty sure we have people listening or watching who are not familiar with the PRC ID. What is it exactly?
Oh, okay, so PRC stands for Professional Regulation Commission. So they're issuing identification cards to different professions that they have been recognized here in the Philippines. So one of these professions is librarianship. So since I'm a professional librarian, I passed the licensure examination years ago. So I have this ID. Jonathan also has one. And yeah.
Wait, so are you saying if you fail to renew your PRC license ID this June, that you can no longer practice librarianship in the Philippines? Is that how it goes?
Well, that is going to be a long discussion. So that also includes a discussion on professional identity and a discussion about the entire librarianship community here in the Philippines. So maybe we can talk about that next episode. It's about identity and community and records. Okay, so thank you, Bono and Jonathan, for joining us today. And also thank you to our listeners, to our viewers for joining this, our second episode. So for this episode, we talked about the importance of records as forms of identification. And of course, just like any type of records, identification cards have limitations. Okay? And we also discussed the primary and secondary values of records. And at the same time, we tried to introduce the concept of records life cycle, a records continuum, wherein the archivists and records managers should work together in the creation of records so that proper information would be captured or the needed information would be used efficiently. And also we talked about the categorization and classification that we're using as records managers and even as administrators as we use and fill out this identification cards. So hope to see you next episode, and that's it. Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been For the Record. For the Record is brought to you by UP-SLIS. Find out more about the school on our website at upslis.info. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to our channel for more fun conversations on archives and records. See you soon!